Without further ado, I'll hand over to David and Emma from London Living Streets, who are going to be talking to us about the launch of Footways.
Can you see me? Sorry.
We can, David. We can see the presentation.
Okay, I'll leave the presentation. So Emma will be showing you later our great map that we produced with Footways. We're going to talk about walking past and future. I'm the ghost of Christmas past, and Emma will represent the future. What we want to show really is also how this map and the work we're doing about getting people walking in central London grows out of a study of history. So next slide, please. A very brief history of medieval London. As the great authority on medieval London transport has said, it was a pedestrian city. Though there were traffic, it was mainly what one might call delivery traffic, be it cattle going to market or wares being brought in for sale, with the odd aristocrat perhaps cramped up on his horse. This is a wonderful image of London Bridge in a great book by Dorian Gerald about the buildings on London Bridge. 500 people, a great mixed high density development. Next slide, please. As London spread out from the 17th century, first into Covent Garden and then further north and west, there were very significant pedestrian improvements, and residential environment was created in which people could walk around with ease. There were new difficulties. The coach comes in the 16th century, and that has to be accommodated. But we have a whole set of improvements, which I'll now describe. On the bottom left, you see Regensburg. And Regensburg has wonderfully preserved, or at least recreated, its medieval streets and pavements. And a key feature there is that, as in medieval London, the streets were paved, but the drainage, insofar as there was any, was usually down the centre, and there are no pavements. From the 17th century, particularly, we begin to see some sort of protection for pedestrians. If you go to the top left, you can see there are bollards there to protect pedestrians from coaches, and also, whilst the street is probably cobbled, there are some form of sets on the pavement. A pavement is created. Now, these were still quite rare in the 17th century, so Old Slaughter's Coffee House that Robert may remember on St Martin's Lane, where all the artists gathered, was known as the Café on the Pavement because pavements were so rare. However, by the 18th century, we start to get, this is Portland Place, York stone used paving slabs, still very expensive and only used for the most prestigious developments like Bedford Square. But increasingly, with the coming of the railways, spreading all out over London. So you get the sort of paving we saw before it was dug up and concrete sets put in place. Next slide, please. A great thing about the 18th century was the creation of low traffic neighbourhoods. There's nothing new here. And whilst Rees-Mogg has declared, we must stop the war on pedestrians on motorists by putting these in, what we really need to do is to go back to an era when pedestrians were cared for. The top two slides are Queen's Square, and you see where the square was, where the building on the right-hand side juts out, and the statue of Queen Anne. Across by the statue of Queen Anne in the early 18th century, they built a wall to stop through traffic and to create a lovely pedestrian environment. Elsewhere, we had many bollards and gates. A good example is one on the right in the Bedford estate, and across the whole estate, there were ways of preventing through traffic and creating a great place for residents to enjoy. Much helped, of course, by the new road, which was the bypass, now the Euston Road, Pentonville Road, etc., which took the traffic as going to the city and especially to Smithfield. Next slide, please. So as London expanded, more and more people worked. We don't have many figures about pedestrians, as I think Robert said earlier, but the one we do have is this evidence to the Select Committee on Metropolitan Communications that showed a staggering 400,000 people walked into and out of the city every day. This is after the railways, but you see the railways are carrying quite small numbers of people. And similarly, the omnibuses. So people from all over inner London were making that walk into central London. Next slide, please. Things began to change from the, well, I say here mid-19th century, really from about 1870 to 1880. And the real turning point was the horse-drawn tram, which, unlike the omnibus was quite expensive and really was for use of the low middle classes, etc. The tram on rails was much cheaper and could be used by working men. But even in the late 19th century, very, very large numbers of people walked in from Islington, Peckham, etc., because even the tram was too expensive. And perhaps they liked the exercise, but maybe that's a little too hopeful. Next slide, please. Alas, towards the end of the century, well, throughout the late 19th century, there were many changes occurred. I'm not sure if you can see this, but if you look at the various roads, you can see where the bollards or gates were, just near the G in Gordon Square, or the T in Taverton Street, Ensley Street, Upper Woburn Place, all had gates. Sorry, I can't show you on my slide, but you see how the road is blocked off. So you have there a low traffic neighborhood. Towards the end of the 19th century, you get a big campaign against this, led, surprise, surprise, by the cabbies, and the clinching argument against them, and of course the Metropolitan Board of Works, who are obsessed with the flow of traffic. But the clinching argument was the Prime Minister found it very inconvenient getting to King's Cross because of the low traffic neighbourhoods. So in 1890, legislation was passed to abolish them all. Alas, and then the quiet residential streets of London were given over to the massive through traffic. Next slide, please. At the same time, a whole host of new roads were built. Farringdon, Clerkenwell Road in the 1870s, Shaftesbury Avenue, Charing Cross Road, Rosebery Avenue, Queen Victoria Street in 1850 near Westminster. And then the big daddy of them all was Kingsway, created in Edwardian times, the last and biggest of them all. A whole series of streets like Wick Street shown centre top, disappeared, 500 historic properties swept away, and the only house of all those that survives is this one named the Old Curiosities Shop in Portugal Street. And of course, we had Kingsway. The tragedy was of course, that though Kingsway was built to take the flow of traffic, all the other streets remained open. So Drury Lane, Bow Street, Wellington Street, etc. still have lots and lots of traffic, even though we built this mammoth new road. Next slide, please. Parking as well. In the 18th century, we had lots and lots of mews built. This is where people kept their carriages. In the 20th century, they sold off their coach houses because they could park their cars on the street. Well, one of the related things. The history of parking is very interesting because the early editions of the Highway Code, following on from various 19th century highway acts and legal opinion from the 18th century, was that you should not leave for any length of time vehicles on the highway. It was an obstruction of the highway. Motorists simply ignored this and left their cars there. The police refused to enforce, and after the war, legislation was retrieved. So our streets are now a dumping ground for cars parked often 96% of the time in London, with the owners having to make no personal provision for where they should be parked. Just a massive land grab in essence. Next slide, please. Post-war, huge road widening schemes, Park Lane, this is the Euston Road underpass, etc. But more and more traffic jams, building more roads, but you never accommodate them. Next slide, please. But we have a solution to the problems, creating a walkable city, which our new map will help. And we see ancient streets like Watling Street could be wonderful, new, interesting ways of exploring and getting around London, getting from A to B. Let's leave the big roads like Kingsway for the traffic. And now over to Emma to describe the present.
Hello, everyone. I'll try and go as quickly as possible. I think the slides continue, do they, Esther? Oh, maybe not. I'm going to have to share. Do you have the new? Oh, maybe. Okay, I'll try and share my presentation.
Sorry, I'll get them up now.
Oh, thanks, Esther. Great. Well, I'll carry on as you do that. So, yeah, the simple idea, as David says, is about linking London's key hubs, its stations and museums, high streets and working hubs with its older streets, the older street network that David was talking about, which are also often its safest and most interesting and enticing. So this is not about leisure walking, this is getting from A to B, but in one of the most enjoyable ways possible. So, next slide, please. Thanks, Esther. So our argument is if walkers are presented with streets like this, they're going to be drawn down them and they're more likely to make walking a habit and on much longer distances. And I remember that in London, this is quite astonishing, really. The average distance of a walk stage is just 0.32 kilometres, which means that they jump on public transport after just 300 metres. And if they do decide to walk all the way, it's actually less than 1 kilometre. 1 kilometre, I think it's 0.84 kilometres, the average walk all the way trip. So attractive routes help, but when we say attractive, we're not just talking about fantastic architecture and beautiful streets with the beautiful flags that we have hanging over them. It's not just that, or public art, expensive public art. It's also streets that are safe. This is Monmouth Street in Covent Garden, which has been recently transformed by Camden with an experimental traffic order to stop through traffic bombing through. Well, or actually it wasn't bombing through before, but anyway, that creates a safe space for people to walk in. So safe, attractive is also safe. And in a 15 minutes, you can actually, I think you can walk about a mile, maybe 1.6 kilometres, twice the average walk all the way trip. And these walks, oh, sorry, next slide, thanks, Esther. These walks needn't actually take longer than public transport, which is currently under too much pressure with COVID at the moment, or taking a taxi. This image is from the back of our new map, which I'm just going to come on to in a second, which shows you the time it takes to walk between key hubs in London versus other modes of transport. This was done doing Citymap. It's proved quite controversial with taxi drivers that are making lots of arguments. It doesn't take this long to take a taxi between Euston and the British Museum, but it's also factoring in things like wait time. So go and check it out when you get hold of your map, and test out these things, test out these timings too. And any minutes that are lost, obviously made up in health, and you're guaranteed to arrive happier on our routes, and you're guaranteed to have found something new. So the map is out. TfL funded us and Urban Good to make this beautiful map. It's got the routes on the front, and it's got additional tools on the back to encourage additional exploration. So I realise we're running out of time a lot now, so I'm just going to say, go to our website. Next slide. There's the map. Sorry, and then go to our website where there's lots more information. It also tells you where you can go and pick up a map. If you're in London, you can walk to a number of locations, including a couple of visitor centres, some bookshops like Stanford's and Hatchard's and South Kent Books, and some bookshops actually in London now as well, and London Transport Museum, or you can order a copy online. And this concept applies to all cities. So if you're interested in a Footways map, or even just in how we've gone about it, please do get in contact, because we've got lots of ideas to share. Producing a walking map is not only great for just getting people out walking, but actually it's been an incredible tool for walking with council officers and councillors and businesses and cultural institutions and everyone, just to see actually what needs to improve on streets to make them better for walking. Somehow having a route or a nice new map actually just encourages people to get out on the street and look at things in a new way. So yeah, thanks. Please get in touch.
Brilliant, thank you, Emma. I have got my, as I said, I've got my map here, big. Should put it on the wall behind me, but it's fantastic. It arrived yesterday. I haven't really had a chance to look at it yet, but I certainly will do. Okay, I haven't seen any kind of super urgent questions for you guys, so I think what we'll do is let you get off to where you need to be and move on to Laura and Gesine from TfL, and then we can have a wrap-up session of questions and answers at the end, if that's okay.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
I'm going to start sharing the screen.
Thank you.
Can everyone see it?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll make a start, or
yeah,
Laura,
please do, Gesine. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thank you everybody for having us. We've already seen some fantastic presentations, and it's really encouraging and delightful. This presentation is a really bit more from the coalface of implementation. Next slide, please. Just a quick introduction. Laura, can you? Oh, yeah, that's happening. So the two of us is going to speak today. We are both urban design and architects working for TfL in TfL's urban design team. Next slide. We're going to talk about what TfL is doing on the background of COVID-19 and what the challenges we have been facing and trying to make all the good things happening for walking and cycling and active travel. Next. So as the background, next. Obviously, COVID-19, we had this amazing international response around refocusing Streetspace onto walking, cycling, active travel, a place to congregate, and cities internationally have been really the forerunners of what's happening here. Next. But the DfT wasn't bad, did pull its finger out and put this new act out, which gave authorities the permission and the impetus to, reallocate road space to encourage walking and cycling, active travel, and also to enable social distancing. And given how long things normally take, this was pretty radical and very welcome. Next. However, for us, this had very particular challenges. One was obviously the rapid pace of implementation. Everybody working in London knows this is not normally what we do. And also London is very different to other capital cities, or major cities, which have been showing these amazing examples, as in our governance and structure is very different. Trying to coordinate 33 boroughs through bidding, funding, implementing schemes of a network that has to hang together is, thinking about it, a pretty astonishing thing to do. Whereas other cities where you have a unitary authority, they're in control and can push things through far more consistently and straightforward. And also, size of London is initially we're quite constrained in resources in the supply chain to implement such measures. Next. So Streetspace of London was born out of this response from the DfT. And Laura is going to now talk about what TfL has been doing, particularly in the first phase.
Thank you, Gesine. So just to add that due to the scale and pace of delivery required, the borough local implementation plan programs were not appropriate for this plan. Hence, we kind of quickly suspended them. And this is how Streetspace for London plan was launched by the mayor in May. And the program's initial aim was to reallocate space to allow Londoners to safely walk and cycle while socially distancing, and thereby reducing the susceptibility to the virus. So TfL's role on the Streetspace program is basically twofold. So the central government has allocated emergency funds specifically for this program, and we are managing the process of getting and distributing funding to the boroughs as well as on our network. Secondly, we are also ensuring that the boroughs are equipped with the necessary tools to develop and implement the proposals. We are providing them with guidance and strategic analysis data sets to help them with decision making. At the same time, we are mapping the schemes on a single GIS platform to ensure transparency and coordination. And I'm going to talk through these in a bit more detail over the following slides. So the DFT funding is being allocated in 2 tranches. The first tranche of 55 million was awarded in the first part of the year to TfL and the boroughs, and it meant that the boroughs were asked to send bids in record time frames, say 1 or 2 weeks time, and equally astonishing timescales for TfL to assess the 100 of bids. An additional 20 million through the DFT Emergency Active Trouble Fund will be available to consolidate this transition from the emergency phase to London's long-term green recovery. The focus of this fund is to prioritize more space for walking, safe public transport access, and to develop strategic cycling corridors, overall creating a more cohesive network and modal shift from car-based journeys. So our role is to review and assess the bids and make recommendations to the DFT on how to allocate funding. So the interim guidance was first launched in May to help the local authorities and other stakeholders develop schemes to support active travel. It is formed of a main document and 14 appendices. The main document has information on the Streetspace plan and explains the process of getting funding, whereas the appendices include information on branding, traffic management, access to the borough bidding pro forma, and initial analysis and case-making data about travel in London. One of the challenges we encountered in the first round of funding was setting up a bidding process very quickly to enable implementation on street. So this meant we were under a lot of time pressure to develop a bidding pro forma, and we actually couldn't do it to the level we would have liked to, which posed challenges down the line in how the scheme information was reviewed. So on the left, it's a snapshot of the original pro forma, which was an Excel sheet that boroughs were asked to fill in and return. This has created some issues with the consistency of the information received and kind of the need to go back and forth to get more information to assess the proposals. So for the second round of funding, we streamlined the process by having conversations with the assessors and their challenges, and also identifying the gaps in designing the pro forma that kind of set the outputs of the application clearly and gave the boroughs ready-made tools to quickly create a map and access to the checklist, or what they should consider for each scheme, and links to the guidance. And I have to say this also ensured that we received maps with locations, which was one of the big hurdles in the first tranche, like not being able to strategically assess where the location of a scheme is was a big hurdle, as you can imagine. So we also provided London-wide strategic data to help boroughs understand the challenges the schemes may seek to address and identify the potential for different schemes within their boundary also prioritize interventions on an evidence-based approach. The data sets focus on pedestrian and cycle connectivity, and they're looking at this series of metrics that can be applied at a more granular level while trying to address issues such as equality, average pavement width in relation to population density, levels of deprivation, car ownership, potential for road danger reduction, access to schools, and so on. So as the program was developing, we quickly identified the need to have a strategic overview of the Streetspace schemes implemented or under development. We also listened to feedback from boroughs who let us know that they actually need a London-wide map that could offer information at borough level as well, to enable them to plan within their boundaries, but also collaborate with the ADS and boroughs more effectively. So we have set up a working group between TfL and the GLA to map and share information on scheme type, status, location across London, to improve collaboration and planning and address any gaps within and outside TfL. The map is available on Surface Playbook, which has an external interface that boroughs and other stakeholders have access on or can request access to if needed. So to communicate the sheer scale of guidance and data available, we have put everything into one place, launching the Streetspace for London website, together with a logo and branding that you can also see appearing on street wherever temporary interventions have happened. And this is a go-to portal for boroughs and the public, and access to guidance, but also to being able to leave feedback. So in the following chapter, I'll go through some examples of implemented temporary schemes. By late August, around 175 borough schemes have been completed and more are under construction. This image is of the model filter at Broadway Market in Hackney that has actually just been put on ground over the past 2 weeks, albeit Broadway Market has been closed to traffic, I think since April. It was usually closed to traffic on Saturdays to enable the market. But since then, it's been a fantastic response once we got out from lockdown, people just taking to the street every single day of the week. Also in Wandsworth, since July, Norcolt Road has been pedestrianised at weekends only, with the empty road space being made available to sustain local businesses and keep their customers safe. This initiative was led by the borough to offer a lifeline to businesses facing an uncertain future. Also, the scheme required a TfL consent because there were a few bus routes that had to be diverted. So school streets have been around for a few years, even pre-COVID, but with the pandemic, we've only seen an acceleration to their implementation. So actually these images are showing some school streets from pre-COVID. They are usually implemented to encourage walking, scooting, cycling, improve air quality, and most importantly, reduce road danger outside of schools. A vital additional purpose during the restart and recovery will be to provide additional space outside school so that parents can drop off and collect their children whilst socially distancing. The timed closures also offer opportunities to overspill ground floor users and activities that a neighborhood could benefit from, maybe install parklets, kind of referring back to our discussion about how we can green London, and also offer a friendlier environment for informal play that is so important. We've also widened footways at around 34 High Street Town Centre station locations on the TLRN. And we've also created additional time to cross at signaled crossings, and have made changes to create new cycle, pedestrian and bus corridors. The example on the right is from City of London. You're probably aware of Gracechurch Street, in the same vein with Bishopsgate. And on the left is Brixton, which was implemented very closely, I think in April or May, and it was met with a lot of enthusiasm by the local residents. So this have been developed quickly, kind of making use with the kits and materials that were available on the market at that time, without necessarily being as aesthetically appealing. But I think it's important to note that these are at level with the existing footway, kind of creating more of an inclusive access to public transport for vulnerable people. So also by late August, we have upgraded cycle infrastructure of about 50 kilometers, and works have been completed on a new cycle route on Euston Road, pop-up cycle lanes in Camden and at Park Lane, providing cycle connection through use of temporary materials. And here I'm going to hand back over to Gesine, who is going to take you through the last part of the presentation, kind of identifying what didn't really actually work with these temporary interventions.
Yeah, so we've seen some really great examples, but as we do things rapidly, there was trial, there was also error. And what we realized is with the initial surge of interventions that we had some real problems with accessibility and equality of access. So visual people often found it very difficult to navigate these footway widening measures. Sometimes drop curbs were missing, so mobility impaired people struggled as well. And as you can probably see even from that image, with putting up all those barriers, if you're mobility impaired, how do you get into a taxi in and out? Well, you can't. Other issues we had with, obviously, if you do things rapidly, they not always look good, and we are living in a beautiful and a historic city. So how do we marry that up? Big issues around the lack of consultation. I think that's been in the press a lot. People felt these schemes suddenly appear, they haven't been talked about, and that there was often a narrow focus on just creating space for social distancing. Some schemes, we feel there's more of a sense of tokenism. Was about maybe meeting numbers. Again, that image below, I don't know really how much those 1 foot widening or footway is really going to help you with social distancing. And the other element is that we are clearly in a constantly changing world in terms of traffic impacts, how we move around, and is how do you actually ascertain the effectiveness of those measures if you have a constantly changing baseline. And also in the press, obviously, there are big concerns around traffic displacement in neighbourhoods, increase of bus journey times and impact on businesses. So what has this led to is, we go to next slide, is looking ahead is at TfL, we are really working on, next slide, is improving and updating our guidance. So while the initial impetus was all about the response to COVID-19 and getting that social distancing in place, is now working on how do we take that momentum and move that into a green recovery, and that works really towards the implementation actually of the London plan and the Mayor's transport strategy, which is all about getting that modal shift in place and walking and cycling and supporting high streets and local centres. So we're actually not trying to do anything new here, but it's how do we move and take that momentum across to achieving those goals. Next, please. Public engagement, absolutely essential, because that's where one of the biggest backlashes are, that people feel they have not been listened to because we haven't asked yet. So we are launching a program that we are intensively consulting in the environments where we've been putting those schemes in, inviting feedback and building up that communication, both of our roads, but also encouraging local authorities to do this. And essentially, because the implementation could only be done on these emergency and temporary measures, they only have planning permission for 18 months. And in those 18 months, you need to build up the evidence and the consultation to make these schemes permanent. And I think that's our pledge. Nothing gets permanent until you have that formal process of consultation. Next. And monitoring. It's really important we assess which schemes are successful and what do they do, so we can convince people that we are doing the right thing and that they're fully assuring, for example, accessibility and inclusion is met and that it meets people's needs. Next. Now, one of the big tasks we have is how do we do the transitioning of TfL schemes? And we have a very, very long list of schemes. I can't remember how many we actually do have. And the question is, how do we build up an evidence around which schemes to prioritize and which schemes to transition in a very uncertain future? Which are our benchmarks which we are trying to assess schemes against? We also have a challenge around balancing aesthetics versus the funding. Just one back, please.
Sorry.
It's okay. I mean, the DFT is quite rightly, and they're paying us, is saying, well, if you can do things with very cheap materials and very quickly, why can you just not keep those? And particularly in a very, very, cash-strapped world, but at the same time, as designers, we want to make things look good and welcoming and not just a couple of emergency traffic kits. So how do we balance those needs and constraints, and which schemes should we prioritize in this light of the really constrained funding priorities? Should we rather try to do many schemes on a more temporary basis or sort of cheaper basis, or should we prioritizing major schemes and doing them really well? And then, as always, as an authority, we have to look after all types of road users, not just pedestrian and cyclists. So it's really balancing everybody's transport needs. Freight, for example, is a key issue as well. And this is, if you feel TfL has been slightly quiet recently, is because we have to now work with the backlash with some of these schemes. As you'll probably be aware of, the taxi group is taking TfL currently to court with a judicial review, and Wandsworth Council's ending low traffic neighbourhoods, which was one of our really main aims trying to achieve this through the Streetspace plan, is the low traffic neighbourhoods, but not everybody thinks they're a good idea. So this is where we are currently at. And so this is sort of, the feedback from the cold phase. We are here and we are very open to questions and comments and feedback on our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you both for that. That was really interesting. And interesting to see it from kind of your side of the table, I suppose, in terms of what's being delivered at the moment. As you said, it's fairly high profile. I know yesterday there was an article on the BBC about their transport correspondent had done an article about the low traffic neighbourhoods and the kind of battles that seem to be going on between motorists and non-motorists over them. It's interesting, actually. One of the first questions that came through was from Jason, and I'm trying to find it now, saying that he's having issues in Dublin where they had some early success implementing some schemes, walking cycling schemes, but now they're getting quite a lot of sort of backlash from residents over them, and they're worried that they're going to end up kind of going back to where they started. And as you touched on just at the end, there have been a couple of issues, particularly the Wands was one, I guess, and I know there's been some big protests in Islington as well around the LTNs. I just kind of wonder, how do you see it? I mean, is it just a noisy minority, do you think? Is there genuine concerns? As you said, it is I suppose the idea is they are trials, and I appreciate a lot of people don't realise that and say, no, they're not. They're just being imposed on us without any kind of consultation. Certainly from what I've seen on social media and the debates that I've got involved in against my better judgment, there's a lot of misinformation around how ambulances and fire engines aren't getting through and everyone's going to die, without any recognition that by far the biggest obstacle to fire engines certainly is badly parked cars. I know that there's no way a fire engine will be able to get down my road as it stands now, just because of the way that people park, let alone for any modal filters. So I mean, where do you think it's going to end up? I mean, do you think it is just a question of letting things settle down, or do you think that it's kind of going to be harder to implement these as we go forward?
I think if we look at, say, the experience of Millie Holland's scheme in Walthamstow, which was heavily protested against, and the council was good and stuck to its guns, but had to invest a lot in consultation and engagement. So maybe recognizing which we do have to set a time, we have to set aside time and budget to speak and to develop relationships with local people, and local authorities need to do this. And I think we should be honest about that, given their trials, that the whole purpose is maybe some we haven't got right in the first instance, and one needs to have to look on how a network and movement settles down around them. So I think we should be open to tweak them and move them where it needs to be, and they shouldn't be imposed on communities, but allowing communities also to have a bit longer time to experience if they work for them and settle down. And I think it's quite important to take businesses seriously, because it's their livelihood we're talking about, and we shouldn't be sort of brushing those concerns aside. I think we'll end up with a system that will be weighted with local authorities who take the lead there. It would be very much, I think, according to party lines, where some boroughs will do better than others. And yes, we do have an election coming up, so I'm a bit worried it will become more politicised than it needs to be.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've got, for those that are around for the rest of the day, this afternoon, we've got 2 or 3 politicians on our, not this afternoon, sorry, later this morning, I'm losing track. We've got 2 or 3 politicians on our Q&A panel session, so it'll be interesting to get their take on the kind of political dimension to all of this. I might just bring in, see John Dales is with us. John, I understand that you're quite heavily embroiled in the some of the Ealing situations. Do you maybe just give us a insider's perspective?
Yes, thanks, Paul. Yeah, it's just worth an interesting reflection. I think, Paul, you just mentioned an article that Tom Edwards of BBC London put out last night, and that was done in the area where I live. I'm part of a local WhatsApp group called LTN Rebuilders, and there's a bunch of us, about 40 of us, going out basically putting the bollards back, and it's kind of escalating. It's all very peaceful, but I was just looking on our thing this morning. There, bollards are being nicked and vandalized and being put and increasingly put in harder places. We think people are probably taking them home now. But one of the things that's really obvious from going door to door is that there was a march last week. There were thousands of people, probably about 700 or so, and but what you see, all of the objectives were there, so to speak. And I think the real challenge for the politicians locally there and generally is that sounds very noisy. The vast majority, we're just talking to our neighbours and stuff like that. Loads of people are for. Lots more people are just, well, we'll see. We like the idea, but it is inconvenient. And I think the key take home for me, and I think this is a real challenge with a lot of the emergency measures, but it could still have been done, because it happened so quickly that the dialogue, and I know sorry I was late to this, but I know there's been some conversations about this, but some really simple, we know this is convenient, quite honest stuff, this is why we're doing it. It's not just about running. A bunch of you in this area don't really experience that and don't care about it too much. Some of these streets are relatively quiet, but there are a bigger game. There's a greater good. About in relation to climate change, public health, obviously, and road safety. There are these issues out there. We appeal to you to see the greater good. We know it will inconvenience you, and that kind of honesty is quite hard for politicians. It's like, this is going to be great, but that idea of this is why we're doing it. We know for some people, disabled people, for others, the nature of your business, this will be really inconvenient. Okay, but this is why we're doing it, and it's based on a manifesto. A lot of the local objections are about there was the lack of democracy, it's undemocratic because it was just imposed. Well, it's a trial, and that trial is the thing. But also, if you look at the ruling administration's manifesto, is very clear that it was pro-walking and cycling, that it needed to try and limit cars. There was a specific reference to low traffic neighborhoods. They've got transport policies that say mode shift, this, that, and the other. It's absolutely all there. And the ability, if they upfront just communicate, I think, and just to my real lesson for this is actually, even in a hurry, a really well thought out single letter to every household, so that they know what happened here. There was a lot of reaction in a vacuum, virtually, information from the council. And I understand how that happens, but actually we have a real opportunity to take people with you. The vast majority of people aren't noisy, shouty people who are upset about having to drive a slightly long way around. And even some of those, if approached with by a council that's showing empathy and thought about this, rather than just we have to do this, and then that gets away from the idea of, oh, this is just COVID-19 opportunism. So the broader thing is the reason I thought I would just quickly chip in was the fact that I think in all these areas like Cavan and Walthamstow and so forth, there is a vast majority who are susceptible to the greater good story, and so let's tell it, and let's tell it up front. Thanks, Paul.
Brilliant. No, thanks for that, John. A couple of comments that have come in, which I think it's quite interesting actually. Sort of Nick Falk raised a point around, should we make sure that we use correct language, and actually streets being for people and roads being for vehicles, and maybe we do need to accept that some key roads like Euston Road, as an example he gave, are roads. They are about the efficient movement of vehicles. We do need vehicles for a variety of reasons, certainly at the moment. And I'm just wondering whether, appreciate that obviously the comments that Wandsworth made in response to sort of the removal of some of the LTNs was around the fact that the concept of the LTN, great, you have all these kind of internal streets within the neighborhood which are for people, and they're modally filtered, and then the traffic is driven, or use the pun, but it's kind of moved to use the perimeter roads, which are the kind of ones that are focused more for the vehicles. Is there an issue that conflicts then with the idea of perhaps traffic calming the main roads and putting cycle lanes in and narrowing those down, that actually you are kind of doubling up in some ways, or do you think it's important that we do both? I don't know if anyone wants to answer that one.
I think, if I respond sort of from TLL's perspective, it's a mix of both, because what we find in London is that we've got, so to speak, certain roads are A roads, even though they don't look like A roads, going through central London, and where they should have a far more sort of people-focused approach, and where the network is so fine-grained, the whole question about what is a main road and what's a secondary road actually gets very much diluted. And respecting that some streets, say like the Old Kent Road, is more of a through streets as a filter street, where, for example, for cycle lane, we always think like cycling is sort of just one speed, but actually it's not. There's the local cycling, there's the local cycling to your local high street or school, and then there is your faster commuter cycling, which actually has very different needs to your local cycling, and we shouldn't really try to mix those up too much and be really clear in our mind the different functions different streets have. And I wouldn't just say it's just sort of main street and local streets. Local boroughs have very different characteristics on how their network functions, and that's where you make the decision on whether you should have a more, say, secondary network, which is slow and local, and maybe you have to focus on some of the main streets, but then in central London that switches over.
Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah, I remember the process in Walthamstow. I remember the coffin being marched down the street for the death of the shops that were going to be affected when the traffic restrictions went in, and now the photos that we see in all the presentations of everyone sitting outside the cafes and the people wandering along, and it looks very idyllic. So I think certainly my opinion is that there's a real sort of merit in doing the trial schemes and seeing what happens, because I think if you ask people first, you would never get as far as a trial, because the myths and the misinformation, particularly in the age of social media, get amplified so much that you'd never be able to do anything. Whereas actually by putting the trial in, we can see how many fire engines are held up, rather than just hearing lots of people saying that all the fire engines are going to get held up. So I think it is I think it's quite important, and it's a useful experiment to see how we go. Right, we're just about out of time. There's a lot of chat going on. I don't know if there's any specific questions that have come through, although actually John Rowland's just put one about the fact that we've been very London centric, which we have. And maybe this is one for anyone really from this morning who wants to comment on, around how do we kind of deal with, and it's certainly something that I come up against all the time, where we're not looking at unitary authorities particularly. How do we kind of deal with the mismatch maybe between planning aspiration and highway department opinions and views? Robert, have you got a comment on that maybe?
Yeah, it's actually in the in that street design thing. The highway authority needs to work with the planning authority, and as a section within the local authority, it shouldn't be acting as a rogue unit. There are proposals, I believe, to broaden the number of unitary authorities. That's if the government continues on its present course. So I think isn't there a government white paper coming forward? Can't remember. It does remain a problem though, but I think at the root of it, it's to recognise that we're all hopefully working to the same objectives of creating better places for people, and to stop name calling. Yeah, it's something that the Urban Design Group stands for, is a welcome to all professionals from all backgrounds.
Thank you. I would just point out, for those of you that haven't read it, the planning white paper, which is obviously out for consultation at the moment, does talk about the importance of integrating highways and planning more closely, and references Manual for Streets, which is being produced as we speak. I think they're currently shortlisting consultants to pull that together. So hopefully going forward there will be better integration between the planning and the highway side, and certainly allow us to implement some of these good ideas that we've heard everyone talking about this morning. Right, it's 9:29, so we're pretty much bang on time. I will draw this first session of the day to a close.